Assalamu alaikum, I'm Carl Arrindell and welcome back to In Focus, in which I'm delighted to be rejoined by Dr Dr Daulatzai, Associate Professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies and also the Programme in African American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to In Focus.
Thanks for having me.
In a recent interview in The Nation magazine, you spoke about how the aftermath of the recent bombing in Boston brought into sharp focus the nature of the racist state practices. You said that you can see how the figure of the Muslim and terrorism has been expanded to include any threat to the state, as the ruling paradigm of security now dominates US statecraft, you said. Do you see any parallels with the attempts to infiltrate black activist groups in the 50s, 60s and 70s under the project run by the FBI called COINTELPRO, which adopted illegal surveillance, disruption techniques and murder on its own citizens in the name of the US government?
Sure. No, that's a great question. I definitely think that there's deep connections. I mean, I think The Guardian just came out with a piece today on the way in which the National Security Administration, the NSA in the United States, has been wiretapping and collecting data on a whole host of people, which again is part and parcel of this kind of post 9/11 security architecture that Bush and the Patriot Act brought into place. And, you know, there was the Obama administration targeting and wiretapping journalists as well. But while, you know, that's one level of it, there's also a way in which, in particular, Muslim communities have borne the brunt in very direct ways, in most obvious ways. I mean, I think there's like a political will and a kind of public consensus, if you will, that to target and infiltrate Muslim communities is somehow okay, particularly in the context when it's framed within national security debates. So, you know, we've seen both Muslim and non-Muslim communities severely infiltrated. Where I'm from in Los Angeles, the LAPD has kind of expanded its infiltration into Muslim and non-Muslim communities, particularly other black and brown communities who are doing work to kind of challenge police authority. But throughout the country, of course, maybe some of your listeners don't know about the NYPD surveillance program upon Muslim communities. In San Francisco, the ACLU, I think it was, discovered how through the community outreach programs that the Obama administration was trying to create to engage Muslim communities at the local level, that there was a tremendous amount of infiltration and wiretapping and data collection going on. So this is part and parcel of a broader attack, if you will, on and policing the boundaries of dissent, if you will, that again has its legacies within COINTELPRO, which doesn't just take place in the 60s and the early 70s around even civil rights and black power organizations, but goes back even farther than that, all the way to the very foundation almost of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So, yeah.
In the same article, you are quoted as saying that by buying into the logic of anti-terrorism or anti-crime, that we're part of the solution. We can't fool ourselves, you say, because by doing that we become part of the problem and ultimately mouthpieces and ventriloquists for white supremacy, imperial war and the crackdown on communities of colour. Now, just over a week ago, we witnessed here in the UK the brutal murder of a serving soldier, a British soldier on the streets of London, by an individual purporting to be acting in the name of Islam. He claimed his actions were in response to foreign policy of the Western governments, including our own. What I should like to know is your take on that event, which has dominated our news over the last week and a half. And I should appreciate your comments on whether you think it right that the Muslim leadership here in the UK were publicly and very robustly unanimous in condemning this act. Are they, by your own sort of definition, their condemnation, is it a part of the problem?
Right. I think the way you opened the question, which I think is a very good one, a comprehensive question about Boston. I think, you know, Boston happened, you know, or Woolwich happened on the heels of Boston somewhat. So I think that there's some parallels that can be drawn. And when you quoted that part of my piece in The Nation, what I was referring to in terms of like being part of the solution or part of the problem has to do again with how we think about what terrorism is, you know, quote unquote. And I think what I was trying to convey in that point was like when we assume that this idea of terrorism exists, right, and we normalize it, then it's something that the state then, in the interest of state security, has to crack down on and police. We've named it, it has a certain look or face, and now we have to go after it. And what happened in the context of the Boston bombings in the United States was very interesting. A couple things. One, the two brothers who were accused of doing it were Chechen, and were, for all intents and purposes in the United States, considered white. But as some have argued, and a colleague of mine, Zahir Ali, on the Melissa Harris-Lacewell show, argued that while they were white, they were also Muslim. And Islam now in the United States acts in some ways as the one-drop rule. That is to say, like historically within slavery, that to be Muslim now excludes one from whiteness. You're no longer white if you're a Muslim. So Islam and whiteness are antithetical. To be Muslim and white is, you cannot connect those at all. There's a sharp break. You're a non-white, you're an other. And so what happened was, and why I was making that point, is that when we buy into the logic of terrorism, as many Muslim leaders did in the United States, right, and they condemned the attacks and they were vehement and apologetic, et cetera, what they ended up doing was making this argument, which is often made. Yes, there are a few bad apples, so to speak, amongst us Muslims. And you shouldn't judge 99.999% of Muslims by the 0.0001 who do bad things and who are terrorists. But if you understand how the state works, right, the state, in order to find that 0.0001, has to target and profile the whole community, right? So you're not stopping racial profiling when you make the argument that we're not all bad. In fact, you're reinvigorating the state to come in and police and surveil you even more, right? And as I argue, this is like the dog chasing its tail, right? So we're not actually addressing the problem. We're recreating it and reinvigorating it, and instead putting brown and black faces up on TV and on the screen to reinvigorate state power, right? And I think that's deeply problematic. Tim Wise, a critical race scholar, he's a white scholar who critiques white supremacy in the United States. He argued before they found out who these brothers were, he said, if they are found out to be white, like militia members who did the Oklahoma City bombing and whatnot, you will not see a wholesale racial profiling of white people. You will not see a hamlet or rural area in the United States bombed or invaded. You will not see Germany, Ireland, France, or England, wherever they might have come from, where they can trace their descendants to, invaded or bombed or have sanctions placed on them. No, because they're white and they're seen as individuals. Whereas non-whites are not seen as individuals, we're seen as part of a group. And again, when we buy, so I say all that to say that when we buy into the logic of terrorism and we promote this idea of we're fighting terrorism just like the state is, I think we end up reinvigorating the very kind of policing that we claim to be fighting.
Now, despite all attempts, including a much hailed, I will say that much, initial speech by the current Prime Minister, David Cameron, who called for unity and to reject any suggestion that the Muslim community bore responsibility for the heinous crime, in which he also stated that the attack was a betrayal of Islam and urged all to recognise, and this was quite historic, that the majority of victims of terror were in fact Muslims. We've seen other senior political figures, such as the former Prime Minister Tony Blair, bluntly declaring that what we are facing is a profound problem with Islam. Last weekend, he wrote in the Daily Mail, and I quote, "There is a problem within Islam, from the adherents of an ideology which is a strain within Islam. We have to put it on the table and be honest about it," he says. Of course, there are Christian extremists and Jewish, Buddhist and Hindu ones, but I'm afraid this strain is not the province of a few extremists. It has at its heart a view about religion and about the interaction between religion and politics that is not compatible with pluralistic, liberal, open-minded societies. Does his represent the voice of, as you've coined it, white supremacy, imperial war and the crackdown on communities of colour, or is he simply recognising a valid threat to a progressive, international, liberal, democratic ideal?
Right. I think if we think about, I think I can only think about those words coming out of, say, for example, former President Bush or the current President Barack Obama, and had those words be spoken. I think we would have to argue that this is a typical Orientalist logic, in which, again, Islam is seen, in the public mind, predominantly to be the source of so-called terrorism. And as a result, Islam, and this is coming not just out of the right in the United States, it's also coming out of liberal and left circles as well. There's a deep kind of anti-Muslim racism, even on the far left in the United States, that sees Muslims as inherently violent and extremist, right? And this is part of a larger narrative around Orientalism, right? That sees Muslims as anti-modern and pre-modern. Instead, what I would argue is that we need to really think about and redefine what terrorism is, right? And what violence is, because, you know, while it might be easy to say that terrorism or violence might take the face of what happened in Woolwich or in Boston, for example, we have to also understand that poverty and inequality are violence. We have to also understand that invasion and sanctions are violence. In fact, we have to also understand that the very structure of how the globe is ordered, this north-south relationship, the immense amount of debt that the global south owes to the global north, that's a very violent order, right? So when we begin to think about these ideas of who or what is a terrorist, we have to really get at a broader question of what is terrorism broadly defined. Within liberal philosophy, classic liberal philosophy, if you will, states are sanctioned to use violence. It's okay for states to use violence to protect themselves. Non-state actors cannot. It's illegal in many ways, right? The UN has had these debates on who or what is classified as terrorism, and they've gone back and forth, and you can see a very sharp divide between the European and the United States definition of terrorism and the Global South's definitions of terrorism, right? One, from the Global South's perspective, that gives dignity to people's resistance, right? Whereas for the West, it's those who threaten the West's control. And so I think it's important that we redefine what terrorism is, because right now it's being exclusively projected onto a particular group of people without understanding not just what it's a response to, but what in fact are the real sources of violence in the world today.
Talking about the definition of terrorism, it's rather interesting that one of the suspects who committed the crime in Woolwich attempted to defend his attack before the police even arrived on the scene in a video which was captured on a mobile phone. And he said, and I'm quoting him, "The only reason we have killed this man today is because Muslims are dying daily by British soldiers." Adebolajo said in the video, "It's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth by our law. We swear we will never stop fighting you until you leave us alone. So what if you want to live by the Sharia in Muslim land? You are extreme, you are the ones. When you drop a bomb, do you think it picks one person, or rather your bomb wipes out a whole family? This is the reality." Should all reasonable, right-minded people be condoning or condemning his logic? And should we, as some have suggested, now be engaged in a debate on foreign policy issues and radicalisation issues, or both at this time?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's absolutely. I mean, I think all reasonable, right-minded people, as you say, we should be condemning all forms of violence. And again, that goes back to my previous point about what is violence. Again, we tend to think about the spectacular as violent, right? And we don't think about the way in which the state has kind of naturalized a particular way of functioning that it deems central to just state functioning. It doesn't classify it as violent. And so we have to understand what state violence is. And so all reasonable and right-minded people need to condemn all forms of violence, absolutely. I'm somewhat familiar with the Woolwich case, but what I do know is, as I've been hearing in my talks throughout London so far, has been that when the issue of British foreign policy was raised by this guy, that it was quickly dismissed and silenced, and the argument was, we don't talk about foreign policy. This is a domestic act. It's separate and distinct from, what the British do abroad, and this is in some ways also, quote unquote, terror coming home, right? And this separation of the domestic and the foreign is something that I talk about in my book as well, that in the United States context, Malcolm was trying to implode, if you will. He didn't want to create this separation between domestic politics and U.S. foreign policy. He saw them as intimately linked, right? For him, white supremacy and capitalism were global phenomenon that had to be fought on all fronts. And it's something even Dr. King himself sought to break from, right? He was part of a civil rights establishment that created a separation between domestic U.S. politics and its global ambitions. In fact, the mainstream of civil rights bought into the anti-communist logic. But King, as some of our viewers hopefully know, in his Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967, writes, and the coda is to that speech, it's Beyond Vietnam, breaking the silence. King wants to break the silence between the domestic and the foreign, and he argues that Americans must think beyond the calling of the nation. They have to listen. This is King's words. Americans have to listen to those that its nation calls enemy, because they might have something to say about the United States, right? And so here's King seeking to break that silence, to bridge, not necessarily even to bridge, to see the domestic and the foreign realms of U.S. power as intimately linked. And I think if we think about a potential analog for what happened in Woolwich, I think that's precisely the kind of debate that needs to be had, right? What is British foreign policy? How is it tied to U.S. foreign policy? How is it part of a deeper legacy of colonialism? And what might that mean for everyday people and their sense of security, if you will, especially when you consider what people in the global South, in the third world, are facing on the daily in terms of like the insecurities of their lives.
Now, we've seen in the UK post-Woolwich a spate of attacks on mosques, on individuals. Just in the last couple of days, one mosque in Muswell Hill in London was firebombed and has been essentially razed to the ground. Mm-hmm. There's a vigil taking place this evening outside the mosque. What do you think the Muslim community and the wider community ought to be doing in response to a growth in, some would argue, far-right attacks on these issues?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Muslim communities and all communities of color in Britain, and not just that, mainstream white communities need to be on the forefront of putting a halt to this kind of activity. But I would say that groups like the EDL, are not necessarily an exception to the norm of British society, right? In many ways, they're woven into the fabric. They're in some ways normalized. That's to say that if we got rid of the EDL, would that eliminate the idea of racism in Britain or white supremacy in Britain? I don't think so. So I think that there are more systemic forms of racism that need to be addressed. And so as a result, I do think communities of color need to be on the front lines of those struggles, but so do their white allies who are aware of the way in which white privilege benefits them at the expense of other communities.
Now, in contrast to the initial government response, which I spoke about, the speech made by David Cameron, last week we heard the news of the establishment of a new extremism and radicalisation task force in which individual ministers have been charged with exploring ways to combat extremism and radicalisation within our mosques, madrasas, within the prisons and in the wider Muslim community. What do you make of that response? Is it something that you've seen the likes of in the States? How does it relate to their experience there?
Absolutely. No, I mean, Representative Peter King opened up radicalization hearings against Muslims. There's a whole discourse around counter-radicalization or counter-extremism as well. And I think it's what I mentioned earlier. I think that, as I argue in the book, in the epilogue of the book, that I think we have to not run from the word radical. We have to reclaim the language of radicalism, and we have to redefine it for our current moment. Because I think what these fears, or what these hearings are, and these committees, for example, in Britain, or if they take place in the United States, they have set up a whole kind of domestic apparatus where Muslim communities police other Muslims, so to speak. They become kind of the gatekeepers of policing radicalization. And to me, this is about really policing the boundaries of dissent within Muslim communities, right? For fear of too deep a critique of the United States, of its inequality. And what I would argue is that Muslims and other communities of color who are going to soon, if they're not already, victims of this kind of targeting, we need to reclaim the idea of radicalism and redefine it to meet our purposes so that we create a more just and democratic order. And I think that that's the central focus of what communities are that I'm engaged with in the United States, is to try and reclaim this term. But again, we have to understand how radicalization and extremism as a set of ideas, or a discourse, if you will, is used by the state to police and monitor the boundaries of dissent. And to me, I find that to be very dangerous.
So would you suggest that there should be a quite bold, robust challenge to the whole notion of this sort of radicalization exploration by government?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is to take a step back, and for communities, as I'm sure they are doing in Britain and in the United States, as those in the United States are doing as well, is to stand up and speak strongly in a dignified manner and very clearly about the positions that they hold on a whole range of issues around economic injustice, around U.S. militarism, on racial inequality, on patriarchy and gender inequality. I think it's important that those of us who are invested in these kinds of debates be very clear about what we mean by radicalism and what we mean by embracing this kind of radical tradition that Malcolm was deeply a part of. So I think that's the important step that needs to be taken. If we end up speaking within the language of the state, then to try and challenge the narrative of radicalism plays again into their logic of what radicalism means, and we only then come off as the extremists that they already think that we are.
So you would defend, for example, the right of universities and Islamic society universities to host open debate and invite international speakers, some who might have views which are not necessarily pleasant to all listeners, but who are operating within the law. Is it right that we should defend the right of them to speak? I
mean, I'd like to encourage debate everywhere. Open, honest, critical public debate, I think, is central to popular people's struggles. It always has been, and it will continue to be. So absolutely, I would support something like that, because I think that without a critical space of debate, we're not, as either individuals or communities, whether you want to call them nation states or the world at large, going to grow and question certain fundamental so-called truths that people presume to be the case. So I think open debate is obviously something that I would welcome.
Dr. Suhail Daulatzai, I'm afraid we've run out of time in our second segment, but it's been an enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on Islam Channel.
I appreciate it, Carl. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.